In 2021, the District Municipality of Muskoka received provincial funding through the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks to conduct 12 technical projects coined Making Waves. The projects aim to examine existing conditions in the Muskoka River watershed, explore ways to reduce the impacts of flooding, and enhance watershed health. These projects will lay the foundation for an integrated watershed management approach for the Muskoka River watershed that seeks to manage human activities and natural resources together on a watershed basis, taking into consideration the connected interests and needs of the environment, economy, and society. The district has led the projects with assistance from an established community roundtable, which includes representatives from the Muskoka Watershed Council, area municipalities, local businesses, and various community organizations across the watershed. The reports and accompanying video presentations for the 12 projects have been prepared by consultants who specialize in the subject matter.
Hi everyone, my name is Steve Hill. I'm a senior ecologist at Dugan & Associates, and I'm excited to be here to give you a high-level overview of the natural capital inventory component of the Muskoka River Integrated Watershed Management Plan. I am here on behalf of our team that was composed of Dugan & Associates, Terra Story Environmental Consulting, and Phoebe AI. The main objectives of our study was primarily to undertake a series of data collection, data consolidation, and mapping exercises to improve the locational accuracy and improved understanding of characteristics of primarily watercourses, first and second order streams, wetlands, and vernal pools, but then also to take that information and look at some of the more important ecological functions that are represented by the natural heritage on the landscape, such as habitat for rare species, species at risk, so species of conservation concern, identify the location of uncommon land cover types, identify areas that contribute to stormwater and spring runoff capacity, and to map out potential significant wildlife habitat areas. So the main scope of work that we had was divided into two phases. So phase one was primarily an exercise in data collection and consolidation. And so that involved reaching out to a number of different stakeholders, identifying what data is available and consolidating that into a comprehensive GIS. And so a number of stakeholders and data sets that we did rely on heavily that should be kind of highlighted as a special note include the forest resource inventory data set from Westwind, the element occurrence records from the Natural Heritage Information Center, and research grade species occurrence records from a variety of open citizen science initiatives that are housed in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. The second phase of the work involved kind of heavy GIS processing of existing data, field work, and then modeling to characterize the land cover of the Muskoka River watershed, to undertake the watercourse mapping updates, to identify the location and characteristics of wetlands, to identify the potential location of vernal pools, and to map out some of those ecological functions that were mentioned as part of the main objectives. So species of conservation concern, rare vegetation, land cover types, areas that contribute to stormwater spring runoff retention, and significant wildlife habitat. So the next few slides, just going to give a very high level overview of each of those in terms of the objectives, methods, and main results. The first undertaking as part of the phase two component of the natural capital inventory was to classify the land cover for the entire watershed. And so for this, we used a couple of different approaches. We used a supervised learning approach, which uses artificial intelligence to train a model that predicts various types of land cover. And then for the other approach, we consolidated existing data from the forest resource inventory. And so those data that were compiled and integrated are shown in the map that's on this slide. And not surprisingly, forest cover had the highest percentage cover, 63%, followed by wetlands and aquatic systems. So collectively covering about 95% of the landscape, followed by anthropogenic and agricultural lands at about 4%, and then less than 1% was the combined coverage of meadow, shrub, and barren land cover types. So the main objectives for the data and mapping enhancements for the watercourses was to identify the locations of higher order streams, so first and second order streams, those small ephemeral headwater stream systems. And so the approach that was taken was a series of GIS processing steps using the 2019 FRI LiDAR digital terrain model using ArcHydro. And so in processing that, we were able to kind of refine and identify the locations where these very small ephemeral features exist, and integrate that with the Ontario Integrated Hydrologic Network. So we're able to kind of tie that into the existing watercourse network. So kind of the main finding from this exercise is that we ended up being able to identify over 9,400 kilometers of reaches for first and second order watercourses at a very high resolution. So just to give an idea of the change in resolution, looking at this slide, you can see on the left is the existing location of those headwaters of a headwater system, and it's kind of a faint blue line, and it kind of cuts diagonally from the top left to the bottom center of the image, that blue line. And with the refined mapping, you can see on the right the green line that follows that kind of circuitous flow path that seems to exist on the aerial imagery. The main objectives for the data and mapping enhancements for wetlands focused on being able to improve the locational accuracy of wetland features, so being able to identify where there are their boundaries and also their characteristic type. So the approach that we used for this was a supervised deep learning model that was trained on the field work that was undertaken and digitization of wetland features from recent studies. And so from the data set that we had to train the model, we were able to identify 6 types. Bog fen had to be lumped together because they're difficult to separate using aerial imagery. Conifer swamps, deciduous swamps, mixed swamps, open marsh, and thicket swamps. So the main result was that we were able to identify over 49,000 hectares of wetland, which is about 60% more than the existing combined wetland layers that we were using at the outset. So that included wetlands in the FRI mapping from the province and from the district. And in terms of the breakdown, treed swamps, so the conifer swamp, mixed swamp, deciduous swamps were approximately 50% of the wetland types. Open marsh was about 30%, thicket swamp 15%, and bog fen type about 7%. The objectives to map out the location of potential vernal pool features was originally to build on an existing modeling approach and expand it into areas that hadn't been mapped within the watershed. But based on some field work and some other logistical issues with using that modeling approach, we ended up developing a slightly different modeling approach that instead of using just aerial imagery and aspects of aerial imagery, we used the high resolution LiDAR. And so for this particular approach, we ended up using a depressional analysis using the LiDAR that identifies kind of where depressions exist across the landscape that end up kind of pooling water in a context that would result in creating a vernal pool type of habitat, and then also using and overlapping that with vegetation mapping. And so the results of the analysis were that we were able to identify over 400 and 39,000 potential vernal pool features. And based on the field verification work, when we combined the analysis coming out of the LiDAR with the wetland analysis mapping, we had about a 90% accuracy with field verified vernal pool locations. So the next series of maps show the results of the key ecological functions analysis and mapping that we undertook. And so the first objective under that series of mapping exercises was to identify the data or locations of species of conservation concern and map out habitats. And so from the data set that we created by consolidating species occurrences from the NHIC and the GBIF data, we were able to consolidate 40,000 occurrence records, which represents 185 different rare species. And just by nature and virtue of the how that data is collected, it tends to represent areas that are accessible and where people tend to visit. So it's good to have that data, but it doesn't necessarily give a good interpretation of the extent of potential occurrence and habitat, or sort of distribution and habitat of these species. So we did identify a number of representative species that we undertook habitat mapping for. And so the species were selected based on, one being species of conservation concern. Secondly, they species that had a number of records or sufficient records to be able to derive a model that could be created to predict their habitat type, distribution, and potential for occurrence. And that represented a variety of different habitat types. It definitely what ended up being reptile heavy, so a number of snakes and turtles. And so kind of two approaches were taken. So for most of the species, we ended up using an approach called maximum entropy, which uses existing species occurrence records and uses machine learning to understand the relationship of underlying habitat predictor variables that are associated with those occurrences, and then also takes into account the distributional trends. And so that was used for Blanding's turtle, common five-line skink, eastern hognose snake, eastern ribbon snake, Massasauga rattlesnake, monarch, spotted turtle, and wood thrush. And then a kind of more traditional habitat suitability based approach based on expert input on known habitat relationships were used for little brown myotis. And so just as an example here, this is the mapping output for wood thrush, and kind of shows the predicted occurrence and distribution of habitat for wood thrush using a Maxent model. And just kind of anecdotally, when this is compared to, for example, the last breeding bird distributional mapping, shows up kind of quite well in terms of a lot of the higher quality habitat existing within the more central locations of the watershed, and less so on the peripheries, kind of along Georgian Bay or into Algonquin Park. And so we have this mapping for each of these different species, and we tied that only to the sub-watersheds where the species were known to occur, so we didn't so that we avoided over predicting potential habitat for species that we know are more restricted to, for example, the Georgian Bay shoreline. The next key ecological functions analysis focused on trying to identify areas within the watershed that contribute to stormwater and spring runoff retention. And so for this approach, we used a methodology that's outlined in the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System that focuses on identifying the flood attenuation capabilities of wetlands based on their site type, so whether or not they're isolated, palustrian, lacustrine, or riverine. And so the idea here is wetlands that are isolated, for example, are going to be 100% effective in providing flood attenuation functions because they're not connected to any of the watercourses, whereas palustrian is also going to play an important role for, but it may have ephemeral watercourse systems that feed into the overall watercourse network. So not 100% efficient, but are going to play an important role in flood attenuation. And then lacustrine and riverine system or wetlands, where it's kind of a bit more complicated. The efficacy of lacustrine or riverine wetlands in moderating flood is really going to depend on their locational kind of context relative to watercourses or where they are as part of a within an open water lake system. And so based on taking the wetland mapping that we derived and then using this classification, we were able to identify where these different wetland site types were, and kind of the combination of lacustrine and riverine is 2/3 of the water, or not the watershed, but the wetland types. Palustrine is represented by 22%, and isolated wetlands represented about 12%. The final set of mapping that was undertaken for the key ecological functions was to identify the potential location of significant wildlife habitat. So for this exercise, we actually ended up using the forest resource inventory base layer just because of timing, and the method that we used relied on the ecoregion 5E criteria that identifies significant wildlife habitat to candidate level primarily. So there are a few exceptions. So for example, in this map that's shown here, we show the potential occurrence and distribution of old growth forests. And so for this, we kind of use some other criteria that define kind of the age of the of forest types that are part of the confirmed category for significant wildlife habitat. But just if we, for example, if we'd use just the candidate criteria, the entire watershed would have lit up, just because just about every forest has the potential. But because we had the FRI with the age information in it, we were able to home in on forest stands that are quite a bit older. And so in total, there's 36 maps for different types of significant wildlife habitat that look very similar to this, with the location and distribution of candidate significant wildlife habitat identified based on that criteria from ecoregion 5E. Another element of the significant wildlife habitat mapping was to identify the potential location of uncommon vegetation cover type. So this was identified as one of the main objectives for the key ecological functions analysis, but because it kind of has the same criteria and kind of definitions under significant wildlife habitat, we used that approach. And so for this, for example, for this particular set of analyses, we identified the locations for bog fen. It's bog habitats that are the rare habitats, but because the approach that we used couldn't discriminate between bog and fen, given the aerial photo interpretation, we lumped those together. And then the FRI data was used to identify potential location of red spruce forests and white oak forests. And then we also digitized the known location for the Atlantic coastal plain marsh communities. That was a very quick overview of the phase 2 objectives, methods, and results. So to kind of summarize, I think the key results from the study really would be that we've been able to create a consolidated land cover classification for the entire watershed that is multi-stage. Like the coarser level classification that we created that just focused on wetland, aquatic, and terrestrial features is very accurate. And then even refining that down into specific cover types provides a pretty accurate overview of the different natural capital land cover types that exist across the watershed. We were able to add over 49,000 hectares of potential wetland feature occurrences across the watershed. So that kind of builds on the existing data sets that are available from the province, the district, and the forest resource inventory data sets. We added over 9,400 kilometers of first and second order streams. So there's headwater stream systems that are relatively small and ephemeral within the landscape, but play an important role in providing habitat and hydrologic functions for the watercourse system. We were able to identify the potential location of over 439,000 vernal pools with an accuracy of about 90% based on our field validation work. We collated over 40,000 records of rare species at risk that represent 185 different species from the various data sets that we looked at. And we were able to provide interpretation and comprehensive mapping for over 36 different types of candidate significant wildlife habitat types. So collectively, the results of this study provide a much more comprehensive understanding on the location and distribution of a whole variety of different natural capital or natural heritage features and species. And so even though the amount of work and effort that's gone into this project really it's just a snapshot in time. And so there will be additional work that's going to be required ongoing, including validating some of the modeling results that came out of this study and being able to track changes in the features. So in closing, the results that have been provided here really are only it's just a high level overview of the various analysis and modeling outputs that have been created. There's over 100 mapping products that are associated with the report that's been created, and with those mapping products, all of the associated data has been provided to the district. And so these really set kind of the baseline for a whole suite of things that could be used as part of an integrated watershed management plan. And so the first obviously is kind of ongoing monitoring of the watershed. So the data that's been provided is kind of watershed scale, could be scaled down to sub watersheds to understand kind of the distribution and type of land cover, for example, or species or different type of habitat that's present for species of conservation concern. The various data sets could also be extremely useful for baseline screening for any kind of that requires any kind of environmental policy initiative, land use planning, natural heritage systems planning, natural resource applications and aggregate applications. Data sets that have been provided could also be really useful for looking at the functional values of natural capital that exists within the watershed. So being able to tie the ecology to ecosystem valuation based approaches that account for natural assets that are present across the watershed is something that municipalities need to be looking at, and the data sets that have been provided could be really useful for that type of initiative. And as well, again, kind of the data that's provided and the modeling outputs for the various different analyses that were undertaken certainly will require additional inventory and site level inventory to validate what we've mapped out at this scale, given that it is a watershed scale analysis. Even though we did have high resolution data, we know that there's going to be some inconsistencies with what's been mapped at that scale that will need to be refined at the local level. So in closing, I would really like to acknowledge the team that worked on this project, and as well the district's team. There's been a fantastic opportunity to work with the district, and certainly they've been there throughout the whole process to help with the coordination of data collection and keep us on track and kind of clarify any kind of questions that we had. In closing, thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. To find out more about this and other integrated watershed management projects, or to learn more about integrated watershed management in the Muskoka River watershed, visit muskoka.on.ca/IWM projects.